The words of my meditations of our hearts be always acceptable unto you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. As usual, we read the Gospel in an English translation. And so we miss one of the aspects of this passage. The disciples are in a boat. They have found the remains of some boats in the Sea of Galilee from this time. And, they're just like open rowing boats. They're, maybe 16, 20 feet long, made of wood, relatively shallow in their profile. And the Sea of Galilee can have storms. These men probably couldn't swim. So they are in a boat, being rocked by the waves, the wind against them where they're trying to go. They're probably afraid. And then Jesus appears walking on top of the water. And the Greek has Jesus saying the same words that God says to Moses at the burning bush, I am. Our translation has it as it is I, but that's not quite accurate. It's I am. Another little bit that I didn't know until I read a footnote in one of the Bible translations is that there's literary evidence that the Jewish fishermen sometimes carried with them in their boats a wooden club inscribed, I am, and they would beat against the wind. Sort of a magical talisman against sinking, against being overturned by the wind and the waves. So here Jesus, the living embodiment of the God whose very name is a verb to be, saving first the disciples in the boat and then Peter as Peter is sinking. There was another little coincidence around ships and storms and sinking in our scriptures and our worship today, because as many of you know, it is our custom during the summer to invite people to request hymns. This is a chance for you to sing an old favorite that maybe we don't program very often. And today, we have Amazing Grace. And so I did a little research into the story of Amazing Grace. And the author of the words of Amazing Grace, John Henry Newton, was, as a very young boy, a studious and religious boy whose mother, a nonconformist in the early 18th century in England, read him Bible stories, drilled him in the short catechism, taught him English, to read English and even to read Latin. And then she died when he was 6 years old. And his father was a sea captain. And young Newton was sent to sea. Young Newton was not well equipped for life on a British ship because he had a problem with authority. Maybe you have known some young men like this. Maybe you have even been a young man like this. But, you know, when he fell in love and wanted to be with the girl that he loved, he just absented himself without leave from his ship and was picked up by a press gang. Found himself in the British Navy, which is an even worse place to be than a British merchant ship. His father pulled some strings and got him made a midshipman so he'd at least be a junior officer. But again, he wasn't very good with authority. So he, again, deserted, was picked up, was flogged, and was demoted to be before the mast. As if this was not bad enough, he eventually managed to get exchanged from the Navy ship, where he was known as a troublemaker, to another merchant ship which was in the slave trade. And, you know, he seems to have been one of those kinds of employees that you're always happy to send to someone else, because he then eventually was made a servant of a slave trader on an island off the coast of Africa, where he was abused by the common law wife of that slave trader and found himself suffering from malaria, without, clothed in rags, underfed, the butt of jokes from everyone, including the slaves. A wretch, as he said later in his song. When he used the words about himself of wretch, it's a reference to that experience of being, as he said, a servant to slaves. He eventually was exchanged to a different slave trader, and then his father got one of the letters that he had written in desperation and asked one of his friend's ship captains to find him and rescue him and bring him to England. And it was on that ship coming back to England that they encountered a great storm off the coast of Ireland, where the man going up the ladder ahead of young Newton was swept overboard and drowned. And Newton found himself at the wheel of this ship that was falling apart because the owner had cut corners in its construction. And Newton, having, as it happened, just that day happened to have picked up an English translation of the book of The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. and finding himself and the whole ship in peril of their lives, cried out to God and resolved. You can tell this, this was a young intellectual. He resolved that the best course was to ask for the power of the Spirit and then to start acting as though the gospel was true. He didn't exactly believe, but what did he have to lose? So he asked for the power of the Spirit, and his life and the life of everyone on the ship was preserved. And he resolved from thenceforward to put aside his blaspheming, to start being obedient to authority, to make himself the kind of young man who would deserve to marry the woman he still loved. He started praying every morning. Now, I always thought that the story of Amazing Grace was tied in with Newton's repentance of his life as a slave trader. But that is not quite true. He was not actually the captain of a slaving ship until after he became a Christian. He became the first mate of a slaving ship. And then he became the captain. He made 3 voyages as captain of a slave ship, going to the coast of Africa, going up and down the coast, buying slaves, chaining them in the hold, transporting them across the ocean to America. He didn't see a conflict at that time between his Christian faith and his action as captain of a slave ship. In fact, he thought God had put him there. To the extent that he thought that he had a Christian duty towards these men and women and children, it was that he treated them a little bit more humanely than some other slave ship captains. He did not actually stop captaining slave ships until some time after his conversion. And it was not a crisis of conscience, it was an apoplexy, but his doctor said he should not go back to the sea. How then did he eventually come to oppose slavery? It was, in fact, 16 years after he wrote Amazing Grace that he wrote an essay on the African slave trade, advocating for the abolition of legal slave trading in the British colonies. It was a process, I believe, of prayer and of choosing his friends. When he became a Christian, when he decided to act as if he believed the gospel was true, he then started seeking out other people who were acting as if they believed the gospel was true, other people who were centering their life on prayer. When he left the sea, he became first a deacon and then a priest in the Church of England. And it was then that he wrote the words of Amazing Grace, because he and his friend Cowper wrote hymns every day that he shared with his congregation on Sundays. But he became friends with other people in the Church of England evangelical movement who were persuaded of the immorality of slavery. He met an African man whose experience of conversion was remarkably like Newton's own. And he became friends with a young William Wilberforce, and Newton counseled him to continue in his political career. And when William Wilberforce took up the cause of slavery, then Newton eventually shared his testimony of its evils from his experience in it. There was 40 years between his conversion experience and his essay on the African slave trade. 40 years in which I believe God was working on him. But none of us interpret our experience alone. God can be shouting at us, can be pushing us. The Holy Spirit can be at work in us and in the people around us, and we don't hear until we hear it from a friend. We don't hear until there's enough people around us who are also changing their mind. That experience on board ship, which can be seen as the transforming moment of Newton's life, was in fact just an inflection point, a point which in hindsight was the turning point that led him to an entirely different life. But if he hadn't followed it up, if he hadn't started to pray, if he hadn't started to keep a spiritual journal, if he hadn't sought out friends who were doing the same thing, it might have become just another time of multiple times that he had resolved to amend his life and then not followed through. It makes me wonder, what things might God be yelling at me about that I don't see or don't see yet? Or I'm not quite ready to change how I actually live. Amazing Grace became so popular in the United States as part of what's called the Second Great Awakening, when it was put to the music that we now know it with. Before that, it was sung to 22 different tunes. When it became part of the camp revivals, and people gave their lives to Jesus, but at the same time, some of those same people and the missions that they were supporting were wiping out the wild bisons and committing genocide against the Native American peoples of this country. It was 150 years, maybe, until we Christians started to recognize the sin of that. My own grandfather and great-grandfather ran natural gas companies and believed that they were doing a good thing, replacing dirty coal with clean natural gas for heat. Now we recognize the reality of global warming. I wonder how much do we not hear what the Spirit might be saying to us because we're not paying attention to what's happening next door? It also makes me, it's easy to condemn Newton for his blindness for those 40 years. In hindsight, we might say, what a hypocrite. But the reality is that culture change is slow. God's working in someone's life doesn't happen all at once. If someone radically changes their entire personality and their way of being in response to one experience, we don't say that that is God. We say they've had a psychotic break, or they have become part of a cult. We have to give the grace to ourselves and to our neighbors for the slow process of God's working in our lives, at the same time as keeping our ears open, keeping our eyes open, maybe keeping a spiritual journal, spending time in prayer, asking, God, where is your life-giving Spirit today? Where is it leading me tomorrow? And then having the courage to step out of that boat, to say, take my hand, lead me into these uncharted waters, save me from drowning that I fear, but put my trust in you, O God, the one who is and has been and is to come. I am.